Why did my stepdad choose his job interview over taking me to the ER? The cramps started during third period chemistry, while Mr. Albright was explaining covalent bonds, and at first I thought maybe I'd just eaten something bad at breakfast. But within 10 minutes the pain had intensified from uncomfortable to genuinely alarming, radiating from my lower right abdomen in waves that made me grip the edge of my lab table until my knuckles went white. My lab partner Destiny noticed me sweating and asked if I was okay, and I tried to say yes, but another cramp hit and I doubled over, nearly knocking a beaker of solution onto the floor. Mr. Albright stopped mid-sentence and came over, taking one look at my face and immediately writing me a pass to the nurse's office. I gathered my things with shaking hands and walked slowly down the empty hallway, each step sending jolts of pain through my side that made me wonder if this was what dying felt like. The school nurse, Mrs. Kowalski, had me lie down on the vinyl cot in her office and started asking questions about my symptoms while pressing gently on different parts of my abdomen. When she touched the lower right side, I actually cried out, and her expression shifted from concerned to seriously worried. She asked when I'd last eaten, if I'd vomited, if I had a fever, and I answered as best I could through gritted teeth. She took my temperature, and it was 101.3, which she said combined with the location and severity of the pain meant she needed to call my parents immediately. I gave her my mom's work number first, but it went to voicemail after 6 rings. Mrs. Kowalski left a message saying it was urgent, and then asked for another contact. I hesitated before giving her my stepdad Derek's number because he'd made it very clear that he didn't want to be bothered during work hours unless it was a genuine emergency, and I wasn't entirely sure this qualified, even though the pain was making me nauseous and dizzy. Derek answered on the 3rd ring with an irritated, "What?" that I could hear from across the room. Mrs. Kowalski introduced herself and explained that I was in her office with severe abdominal pain and fever, and that she believed I needed to be evaluated at an emergency room as soon as possible. There was a long pause, and then Derek asked if she was sure it was an emergency or if I was just trying to get out of class. Mrs. Kowalski's jaw tightened, and she said in a very professional voice that yes, she was quite sure, and that the symptoms I was displaying were consistent with appendicitis or another serious abdominal condition that required immediate medical attention. Derek sighed loudly and said he was in the middle of something important and couldn't leave right now. Mrs. Kowalski asked if there was anyone else who could come get me, and Derek said my mom was at work too, and that I'd just have to wait until one of them could get there. The nurse's expression shifted to something close to disbelief, and she said that waiting was not advisable given my symptoms, and that if no parent could come, she would need to call an ambulance. That got Derek's attention, and his voice got sharp, saying absolutely not to call an ambulance because our insurance had a huge deductible, and we'd be stuck with a massive bill. Mrs. Kowalski started to respond, but Derek cut her off, saying he'd figure something out and would call back in a few minutes. He hung up before she could say anything else. The nurse looked at me with an expression that was part sympathy and part frustration, and told me to lie still while we waited to hear back. The pain was getting worse, coming in shorter intervals now, and I curled on my side trying to find any position that helped. Mrs. Kowalski gave me a cold compress for my forehead and said she was going to give them exactly 10 minutes before she called 911, regardless of what Derek said, because my symptoms were too serious to ignore. Those 10 minutes felt like an hour as I watched the clock on her wall and tried to breathe through the pain that was now constant rather than coming in waves. Derek called back after 8 minutes and said he'd come get me, but he needed to stop by the house first to change clothes and print some documents. Mrs. Kowalski asked why he needed to do those things when I required immediate medical attention, and Derek's voice through the phone speaker got defensive, saying he had a job interview at 2 o'clock that he'd been trying to schedule for 3 months, and he wasn't about to show up straight from home in jeans. The nurse started to argue, but Derek talked over her, saying the interview was for a senior management position that would basically double his salary and set our family up financially, and that he'd take me to the ER right after. Mrs. Kowalski said that was unacceptable, and that my condition could not wait 2 or 3 hours, but Derek insisted it would be fine, and he'd be at the school in 20 minutes to pick me up. He hung up again before she could protest further. The nurse stood there holding her phone and looking angrier than I'd ever seen her, and then she turned to me and asked if I understood how serious this situation was. I nodded, still curled in a ball, and she said she wanted to call an ambulance, but legally she needed parental permission unless I was literally unconscious or in cardiac arrest. Derek arrived 37 minutes later, not 20, and I could tell he'd showered and changed into a suit because his hair was still damp. Mrs. Kowalski met him at her office door and tried to hand him printed information about appendicitis symptoms and the nearest emergency room, but he waved it away, saying he knew where the hospital was. She said he needed to take me there immediately, not after his interview, and Derek's face got that closed-off expression he always wore when someone questioned his decisions. He said he appreciated her concern, but he was the parent, and he'd make the decisions about my medical care. Mrs. Kowalski's voice got very quiet and controlled as she said that delaying treatment for a possible appendicitis could result in the appendix rupturing, which could cause sepsis and potentially death. Derek actually laughed and said she was being dramatic, that kids complained about stomach aches all the time, and it was usually nothing. He signed me out in the office logbook and told me to get up and come with him. I tried to stand and immediately felt dizzy, grabbing the edge of the cot for support. Derek sighed impatiently and told me to hurry up. He was already running late. The walk to Derek's car in the parking lot took forever because each step sent pain shooting through my abdomen and made me want to vomit. Derek walked several feet ahead of me, checking his phone and not looking back to see if I was keeping up. When we finally reached his Nissan he'd just had detailed, he told me to be careful not to get any dirt on the seats. I climbed into the back seat because the front was covered with his interview portfolio and a dry-cleaned shirt still in plastic. As soon as I was buckled in, Derek pulled out of the parking lot and headed not toward the hospital, but toward our house on the other side of town. I asked weakly where we were going, and he said he already told the nurse he needed to get his documents and make sure he looked professional for this interview. I tried to explain that I was in really bad pain and Mrs. Kowalski had said it was urgent, but Derek cut me off saying that if it was really that serious, I'd be screaming and unconscious, not sitting there talking. He said his sister used to fake stomach aches to get out of school all the time, and their mother eventually just stopped falling for it. At home, Derek left me in the car while he went inside, saying he'd just be a minute. I sat in the back seat with the windows closed and the sun beating down through the glass, feeling sweat run down my face and soak through my shirt. The pain had shifted slightly, becoming sharper and more localized, and I had the distinct feeling that something inside me was very wrong. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and tried to call my mom again, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a rambling message about how I was sick, and Derek was taking me to his interview instead of the hospital, and I really needed her to call back. Then I tried texting her the same information, but my vision was getting blurry and I kept making typos. Derek came back out 15 minutes later carrying a leather folder and wearing a different tie, and he looked irritated when he saw me slumped against the door. He asked if I was going to throw up in his car, and I said I didn't know, which made him tell me that if I felt it coming, I needed to tell him so he could pull over because he couldn't show up to an interview smelling like vomit. The drive to wherever this interview was took another 25 minutes, and Derek spent the whole time talking on his Bluetooth to someone named Philip about quarterly projections and market positioning. I tried to focus on breathing and not throwing up, but the pain was intensifying to a point where I genuinely thought I might pass out. Finally, Derek pulled into a parking garage downtown and found a spot on the 3rd level. He turned off the engine and twisted around to look at me, and for a second, I thought he was going to ask how I was feeling. Instead, he told me I needed to wait in the car quietly while he did his interview, and that he'd take me to the hospital as soon as he was done. I asked how long the interview would take, and he said probably an hour, maybe 90 minutes if they did a full panel. The thought of sitting in this hot parking garage for up to 90 minutes while whatever was wrong with me got progressively worse made me start crying, which seemed to annoy Derek more than anything else that had happened so far. He told me to stop being dramatic and that plenty of kids dealt with stomach aches without falling apart. He said this interview could change our entire family's financial situation and that I needed to understand priorities and delayed gratification. Then he got out of the car, locked the doors with me still inside, and walked toward the parking garage elevator without looking back. I watched him disappear and then sat alone in the car, crying and clutching my side and wondering if people actually died from appendicitis in modern times. I knew theoretically they could if it ruptured and wasn't treated, Mrs. Kowalski had said as much, but it seemed impossible that something like that could happen to me on a Wednesday afternoon in a parking garage while my stepdad was upstairs talking about his leadership philosophy. The pain had become a constant burning sensation now, and I felt feverish and cold at the same time, shivering despite the heat trapped in the car. I'm not sure how much time passed before I realized I needed to do something myself because Derek clearly wasn't going to help me. I tried the door handles, but they were locked and I didn't know how to manually unlock them from inside. I looked around for the emergency release latch and finally found it near the floor, pulling it and hearing the lock pop open with a click that seemed incredibly loud in the silent garage. I pushed the door open and tried to step out, but my legs were shaking so badly I nearly fell. I grabbed onto the car door for support and stood there taking deep breaths, trying to decide what to do next. The parking garage elevator Derek had taken was maybe 30 yards away, but that distance seemed impossible given how weak I felt. I started walking anyway, one hand pressed against my abdomen and the other trailing along the concrete wall for balance. Each step felt like being stabbed, and I had to stop twice to lean against parked cars and wait for waves of nausea to pass. The elevator took forever to come back down, and when the doors finally opened, a woman in business clothes stepped out and immediately asked if I was okay. I must have looked terrible because she came over quickly and put a hand on my shoulder asking what was wrong. I tried to explain about the pain and my stepdad leaving me in the car and needing to get to a hospital, but the words came out jumbled and unclear. She pulled out her phone and asked if I wanted her to call 911, and I nodded gratefully. She dialed and gave the dispatcher our location, explaining that there was a teenage boy showing signs of a medical emergency and requesting an ambulance. The dispatcher asked questions, which the woman relayed to me about my symptoms, and when I described the pain location and fever, she told the dispatcher it sounded like possible appendicitis. The dispatcher said an ambulance was en route and should arrive within 10 minutes. The woman, whose name I learned was Linda Vasquez, helped me sit down on the concrete with my back against the wall and stayed with me while we waited. She asked who my stepdad was and which company he was interviewing with, and when I told her the company name, her expression changed. She said she worked for that company, in their HR department, and asked who specifically Derek was meeting with. I gave her his full name and she looked something up on her phone, then her jaw tightened. She said Derek had an interview scheduled for a senior operations manager position, and it had started 15 minutes ago. I asked if she could go up and tell him I needed help, and she said she could do better than that. She made a phone call and spoke quietly to someone, explaining that there was a medical emergency involving a candidate's stepchild who had been left alone in the parking garage despite being seriously ill. The person on the other end must have asked questions because Linda gave more details, occasionally looking at me with an expression that seemed equal parts concerned and furious. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later, pulling into the parking garage with lights flashing, but no siren. 2 paramedics got out quickly and came over with a bag of equipment, asking Linda and me questions about what had happened. One of them, a young guy named Owen, started taking my vital signs while his partner, a woman named Alicia, called information into their radio. My temperature had gone up to 102.1, and my blood pressure was lower than it should be. Owen asked me to lie back flat and did the same examination Mrs. Kowalski had done, pressing on different areas of my abdomen. When he touched the lower right side, I actually screamed, and both paramedics exchanged looks that told me this was bad. Alicia asked who had brought me here and where they were now, and Linda explained about Derek being upstairs in a job interview. The paramedic's expression shifted to something cold and professional as she asked if Derek knew I was having a medical emergency. Linda said yes. The school nurse had explained it was urgent, and he'd chosen to bring me here anyway, rather than going directly to the hospital. Owen and Alicia got me onto a wheeled stretcher and loaded me into the ambulance, and Linda asked if she could ride along since she didn't want me to be alone. The paramedics agreed, and she climbed in, sitting next to me, and holding my hand while they started an IV and gave me something for the pain that made everything feel slightly less sharp and terrible. Alicia called ahead to the hospital, and I heard her use words like acute abdominal pain, suspected appendicitis, and delayed treatment against medical advice. Owen kept monitoring my vitals and asked gentle questions about when the pain had started and how it had progressed throughout the day. I explained the timeline as best I could through the fog of pain medication, and I saw him and Alicia exchange another one of those looks that healthcare professionals give each other when they're thinking something they don't want to say in front of the patient. The ride to the hospital was quick, maybe 8 minutes, and we pulled up to an emergency entrance where staff was already waiting outside. They wheeled me directly into a trauma bay, and suddenly there were at least 6 people around me, all moving with the kind of urgent efficiency that made my stomach drop. A doctor introduced herself as Dr. Ellen Corey and immediately began examining my abdomen while firing questions at the paramedics about my presentation and history. When Alicia mentioned that I'd been showing symptoms for several hours and that treatment had been delayed by a parent who chose to attend a job interview first, Dr. Curie's expression hardened. She ordered labs and imaging immediately and told a nurse to page the surgical team on standby. The word surgical made everything suddenly very real and very scary, and I started asking what was happening. Dr. Corey's voice was gentle but firm as she explained that my symptoms strongly suggested appendicitis, and that the delay in treatment increased the risk that my appendix had already ruptured or was close to rupturing. They rushed me to radiology for a CT scan that took maybe 10 minutes, and then back to the trauma bay where Dr. Corey was waiting with results pulled up on a computer screen. She came over and explained that the scan confirmed acute appendicitis with signs of early perforation, meaning my appendix was beginning to rupture and leak bacteria into my abdominal cavity. She said I needed emergency surgery immediately, and that waiting any longer could result in widespread infection and potentially life-threatening complications. A surgeon appeared, a tall man named Dr. Jeffrey Lane, who introduced himself quickly and said he'd be performing an emergency appendectomy and would need to explore my abdomen to see if the rupture had caused contamination. He asked if there was a parent present to sign consent forms, and I said my stepdad had been at a job interview downtown and my mom was at work somewhere. Dr. Corey told a staff member to make calls and track down a guardian immediately while they prepped me for surgery because they were running out of time. The staff member came back 15 minutes later, saying she'd reached my mom who was leaving her office immediately but was 40 minutes away, and that Derek's phone had gone to voicemail multiple times. Dr. Lane said they couldn't wait 40 minutes and would need to proceed with emergency consent protocols since this was a life-threatening situation. Everything started moving very fast after that, with people putting a cap on my head and adding things to my IV and wheeling my bed toward doors marked Surgical Suite, Authorized Personnel Only. Linda appeared next to me and squeezed my hand, saying she'd called my mom herself and explained what was happening, and that she'd stay at the hospital until my mom arrived. I tried to thank her, but my voice wasn't working properly, And then an anesthesiologist was introducing himself and explaining that he was going to put me to sleep. The last thing I remember was counting backward from 10 and getting to maybe 6 before everything went black. I woke up in a recovery room with no sense of how much time had passed, feeling groggy and nauseous with a significant pain in my abdomen despite whatever medications they were giving me. A nurse appeared almost immediately and explained that the surgery had gone well, but they'd found that my appendix had indeed ruptured, and Dr. Lane had to wash out my abdominal cavity to prevent infection. She said I'd be on IV antibiotics for several days and would need to stay in the hospital for observation, because ruptured appendicitis was more serious than a simple appendectomy. I asked if my mom was here, and the nurse said yes. She'd arrived about halfway through the surgery and was in the waiting area. The nurse said she'd bring her back in a few minutes once I was more fully awake. I lay there staring at the ceiling and processing that my appendix had actually ruptured, which Mrs. Kowalski had specifically warned Derek could happen if treatment was delayed, and he'd chosen his interview anyway. My mom came in 10 minutes later, and I'd never seen her look so angry and terrified at the same time. She rushed to my bedside and carefully hugged me, crying and apologizing over and over for not answering her phone earlier. She explained that she'd been in a meeting with her phone on silent and hadn't seen the calls until her assistant interrupted to say there was an emergency. By then, I was already in the ambulance, and she'd driven straight to the hospital, arriving just as they were taking me into surgery. She kept stroking my hair and asking how I felt and saying she couldn't believe Derek had done this. I asked if Derek was here, and her expression shifted to something that looked like pure rage. She said he'd finally shown up about 20 minutes ago, after his interview finished, and when he'd tried to come back to see me, she'd told him to get out of the hospital before she had security remove him. Apparently, there had been a scene in the waiting room with my mom screaming at Derek about nearly killing me for a job interview, and hospital security had to intervene when Derek tried to argue that he'd made a judgment call about the severity of my condition. Dr. Lane came by later that evening to check on me and explained in detail what they'd found during surgery. He said my appendix had been severely inflamed and had developed a small perforation that was leaking infected material into my abdomen. He'd removed the appendix and irrigated the area extensively with antibiotic solution, but I'd need to stay on strong IV antibiotics for at least 5 days to ensure the infection didn't spread. He said that in cases of ruptured appendicitis, there was a risk of complications like abscess formation or sepsis, so they'd be monitoring me closely. Then his expression became more serious, and he said that, frankly, if I'd waited even another hour or two before receiving treatment, I could have developed septic shock, which could have been fatal. The delay in getting me medical care, despite clear warning signs, had directly resulted in a worse outcome and longer recovery. My mom asked if the rupture could have been prevented if I'd been brought directly to the ER from school, and Dr. Lane said almost certainly yes. With the timeline of symptom onset, immediate treatment would have likely allowed for surgery before perforation occurred. My mom left the room shortly after Dr. Lane did, and I could hear her making phone calls in the hallway, her voice sharp and controlled in a way that meant she was absolutely furious, but trying to stay professional. She came back an hour later and said she'd contacted a lawyer who specialized in child endangerment cases. When I asked why she needed a lawyer, she said what Derek had done wasn't just poor judgment, it was willful negligence that had resulted in serious harm to me. She said the school nurse had documented her conversation with Derek and his explicit choice to delay medical care for a non-emergency reason, and that the paramedics and hospital staff had all noted the delay and its consequences in their reports. The lawyer, whose name was Catherine Brenner, was going to review everything and determine what legal options we had. I asked if Derek could actually get in trouble for this, and my mom said she was going to make absolutely sure he did, because no one got to endanger her child's life for a job interview without consequences. Catherine Brenner came to the hospital the next day, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who recorded our conversation with permission and asked detailed questions about everything that had happened. She took notes while I described the timeline from when the cramps started in chemistry class, through Derek leaving me locked in his car in the parking garage. When I got to the part about him saying the interview could wait 90 minutes, Catherine stopped writing and looked up with an expression of disbelief. She asked me to repeat exactly what Derek had said about priorities and delayed gratification, and I recited his words as closely as I could remember them. Catherine said that demonstrated not just negligence, but a conscious choice to prioritize his own interests over my welfare, despite being explicitly warned of the medical danger. She explained that in our state, parents and legal guardians had a legal duty to provide necessary medical care to minors, and that willfully refusing or delaying such care could constitute criminal child neglect. My mom asked what that meant practically, and Catherine said she'd be filing a police report and providing all the documentation to the county prosecutor's office. She said whether they chose to press charges would depend on various factors, but the evidence in this case was unusually clear-cut because multiple medical professionals had documented their warnings to Derek and his explicit refusal. She'd also be filing an emergency motion to modify custody arrangements since Derek clearly couldn't be trusted with my welfare. My mom and Derek weren't legally married, just in a long-term relationship, so custody was simpler than a divorce would have been, but Catherine wanted to ensure Derek had no legal authority over my medical care or general well-being going forward. She said the fact that a complete stranger, Linda from the HR department, had shown more concern for my welfare than my own stepfather was damning and would play very well in any custody proceedings. The hospital kept me for 6 days total while the IV antibiotics did their work, and Dr. Lane monitored for complications. I developed a low-grade fever on day 3 that had everyone concerned about an abscess, but additional imaging showed it was just part of the normal inflammatory response, and it resolved with adjusted antibiotic dosing. Physical therapy came by to help me walk around the floor so I wouldn't develop blood clots, and each lap was exhausting and painful despite the medication. Dr. Lane said recovery from a ruptured appendix was significantly longer than from a simple appendectomy, and I'd likely need several weeks at home before returning to school. The difference, he emphasized, was entirely due to the delay in treatment. If I'd been brought directly to the ER from school, I'd have had a laparoscopic procedure and been home in 2 days. Instead, I was looking at weeks of recovery and was lucky to not have developed sepsis. My mom basically moved into my hospital room, sleeping in the reclining chair and leaving only to shower at home and grab fresh clothes. Derek tried to visit twice more, and both times hospital security turned him away at my mom's request. He sent text messages that my mom showed me, saying he was sorry things had gotten out of hand and that he'd just been trying to balance competing priorities. The complete lack of acknowledgement that his choices had nearly killed me was stunning. My mom didn't respond to any of his messages and instead forwarded them all to Catherine Brenner, who said they were helpful evidence of Derek's refusal to accept responsibility. On day 5, a police detective named Sergeant Julia Ramos came to take my statement. She was kind but thorough, asking me to walk through the entire timeline multiple times and clarifying specific details about what Derek had said and done. When I described Derek locking me in the car in the parking garage, Sergeant Ramos stopped writing and asked me to repeat that detail. I explained how I'd had to use the emergency release to get out, and how if Linda hadn't found me, I would have been stuck there through his entire interview while my appendix ruptured. The detective said that added another potential charge of reckless endangerment since leaving a seriously ill child locked in a car could have resulted in death. She asked if I'd felt afraid during any of this, and I said honestly yes, especially in the parking garage when I'd realized Derek wasn't coming back anytime soon, and the pain was getting worse. I genuinely thought I might die there, and no one would find me until it was too late. Sergeant Ramos told me she was sorry I'd gone through this, and that she'd be forwarding her report to the prosecutor with a recommendation for charges. She couldn't promise what would happen, but she said the evidence was compelling, and Derek's conduct had been egregiously negligent. Catherine Brenner called my mom on day 6 with an update. The prosecutor's office had reviewed the police report and medical documentation and had decided to file criminal charges against Derek for child endangerment and reckless endangerment. There would be an arraignment within the next week where Derek would be formally charged and could enter a plea. Additionally, Catherine had filed for an emergency protective order preventing Derek from contacting me or coming near me, which a judge had granted based on the evidence of harm. My mom asked what the potential penalties were, and Catherine said child endangerment carried up to 5 years in prison depending on circumstances, and given that my life had been genuinely threatened by Derek's choices, the prosecutor was treating this seriously. She said they'd offered Derek a plea deal involving probation and mandatory parenting classes, but he'd refused and said he wanted to fight the charges because he hadn't done anything wrong. I was discharged from the hospital on day 7 with a prescription for oral antibiotics and pain medication, plus detailed instructions about wound care and warning signs of infection. Dr. Barry Lane came by for a final check before I left and said I'd healed about as well as could be expected given the circumstances. He reminded me that I'd need to take it easy for several weeks and shouldn't do any heavy lifting or strenuous activity until my follow-up appointment. Then, he looked at my mom and said he'd be available to testify in any legal proceedings about the medical consequences of delayed treatment, because this was exactly the kind of preventable outcome that happened when parents prioritized the wrong things. My mom thanked him, and I could see her fighting back tears as we gathered my things and headed out to her car. The ride home felt surreal, like I'd been gone for months instead of a week, and everything looked slightly different or unfamiliar. Derek's arraignment happened 2 weeks later, and my mom went to watch while I stayed home recovering. She came back and said Derek had pleaded not guilty, and his lawyer had argued that he'd made a reasonable decision based on the information available and couldn't have known how serious my condition was. The prosecutor had apparently played the recording of Derek's conversation with Mrs. Kowalski, where she explicitly warned him about appendicitis risks, and then presented timeline documentation showing Derek had chosen to go home and change clothes, then sit through a 90-minute interview rather than take me directly to medical care. The judge had looked unimpressed and set a trial date for 3 months out, keeping the protective order in place until then. My mom said Derek's face when he saw her in the courtroom had been something between shame and anger, like he couldn't decide whether to apologize or blame her for pressing charges. My return to school came 4 weeks after the surgery, and the first day back was overwhelming. I was still moving slowly and couldn't carry a heavy backpack, so my mom had arranged for me to leave each class 5 minutes early to get to the next one without rushing. People kept asking what had happened, and I gave vague answers about appendicitis and complications, not wanting to explain the full story to casual acquaintances. But somehow word spread anyway, maybe through Destiny, who'd seen me double over in chemistry class. And by lunchtime, there were rumors circulating about my stepdad refusing to take me to the hospital. A few people approached me with sympathy that felt genuine, and one girl named Zara said her uncle had done something similar to her cousin, and it was absolutely abuse to deny medical care like that. The validation from peers who understood how messed up the situation helped, even though I wasn't ready to discuss details. Mrs. Kowalski called me down to her office during study hall and gave me a long hug when I walked in. She said she'd been worried about me and had followed up with the hospital after I'd been admitted. She showed me the notes she'd made during her conversations with Derek, including timestamps and direct quotes, which she'd provided to both the police and my mom's lawyer. She said in 23 years as a school nurse, she'd never had a parent so blatantly disregard an emergency medical situation, and that she'd been haunted by the fear that something terrible would happen while Derek delayed treatment. When I told her about the ruptured appendix and the near miss with sepsis, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then she said she was so glad I was okay, and that she hoped Derek faced serious consequences for what he'd done, because the next child in his care might not be as lucky. The trial started on a Monday in early November and lasted 3 days. I had to testify on day 2, and Catherine Brenner prepared me extensively about what questions to expect and how to stay calm under cross-examination. Walking into the courtroom and seeing Derek sitting at the defense table with his lawyer was jarring. He looked thinner and older than I remembered, wearing a suit similar to the one he'd worn to his job interview that day. The prosecutor, a stern woman named Amanda Reeves, asked me to describe everything that had happened from the moment the pain started. I walked through the timeline carefully, trying to stay factual and not emotional, but when I got to the part about being locked in the parking garage, my voice started shaking. The prosecutor asked how I'd felt in that moment, and I said honestly I'd been terrified that I was going to die, and no one would know where I was. Derek's lawyer cross-examined me and tried to suggest that I was exaggerating the severity of my symptoms and that Derek had made a reasonable assessment that I wasn't in immediate danger. She asked if I'd explicitly told Derek I thought I might have appendicitis, and I said no because I was 14 years old and didn't have medical training, but that the school nurse who did have training had told him exactly that. The lawyer asked if it was possible I'd downplayed my pain to Derek because teenagers often minimized illness, and I said no. I'd been crying and could barely walk and had begged him to take me to the hospital. She asked if I understood that Derek had worked very hard to get that job interview, and that providing financially for the family was also a form of care. I looked directly at Derek when I answered that yes, I understood he'd prioritized a job interview over whether I lived or died, and that seemed like a clear statement of his values. The prosecution called multiple witnesses, including Mrs. Kowalski, who testified about her explicit warnings to Derek and his dismissive response. The paramedics testified about finding me in the parking garage and my deteriorating condition. Linda Vasquez testified about discovering me and calling 911, and mentioned that she'd reported the incident to her company's hiring committee, who had withdrawn Derek's job offer based on serious concerns about his judgment and character. That was news to me, and I saw Derek's face go red when Linda said it. Dr. Lane testified about the surgical findings and stated clearly that the rupture and resulting complications were directly caused by the delay in treatment, and that with appropriate immediate care, I would have had a routine procedure instead of a medical emergency. Dr. Curry testified about the state I'd been in when I arrived at the ER and her concerns about sepsis risk. The defense tried to argue that medical outcomes were unpredictable and that appendicitis could rupture quickly regardless of timing, but Dr. Lane countered with specific timeline analysis, showing the progression of my symptoms indicated hours of delay, not minutes. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on both counts of child endangerment and reckless endangerment. Derek's face went pale when the verdict was read, and his lawyer immediately asked for sentencing to be delayed while they prepared mitigation materials. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks out and remanded Derek to custody until then, denying bail because she said his complete lack of remorse throughout the trial suggested he remained a danger to vulnerable people in his care. Watching Derek being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs felt surreal and sad and satisfying all at once. My mom squeezed my shoulder, and Catherine Brenner said this was the right outcome, and that Derek needed to understand there were consequences for valuing a job interview over a child's life. The sentencing hearing brought a packed courtroom, including several people I didn't know who apparently had similar stories about Derek's selfish behavior and poor judgment. The judge listened to testimony from a court-appointed psychologist who'd evaluated Derek and found him to have narcissistic personality traits with limited empathy for others. The prosecutor recommended 4 years in prison given the severity of harm and Derek's refusal to accept responsibility. Derek's lawyer argued for probation and community service, claiming Derek had learned his lesson and would never make such a mistake again. The judge looked directly at Derek and asked if he wanted to make a statement. Derek stood up and gave what sounded like a rehearsed speech about how he'd been under financial stress and trying to provide for his family, and that he'd made an error in judgment but hadn't intended to harm anyone. The judge let him finish and then said that intent was irrelevant when the harm was both foreseeable and explicitly predicted by medical professionals, and that Derek's continued minimization of his actions demonstrated he still didn't grasp the severity of what he'd done. She sentenced him to 3 years in prison with credit for time served, followed by 2 years of supervised probation, during which he would be prohibited from having custody or unsupervised contact with any minors. She also ordered him to pay restitution, covering all medical expenses not covered by insurance, which Catherine Brenner said would likely be substantial. The judge's final words were that parenthood, whether biological or adoptive or step, carried a sacred responsibility to protect children from harm, and that Derek had catastrophically failed that responsibility in the most basic way imaginable. A job interview would come again, but a child's life lost to preventable sepsis would not. Derek's face crumpled as the bailiff led him away, and part of me felt something like pity, but mostly I just felt relief that he couldn't hurt anyone else the way he'd hurt me. The surgery scar on my abdomen faded over the following months, but never disappeared completely. A thin, pale line that reminded me every day how close I'd come to dying in a parking garage while my stepdad talked about quarterly projections. I finished high school with decent grades, despite missing significant time junior year, and my mom and I rebuilt our lives without Derek's presence complicating everything. Linda Vasquez stayed in touch and became something like a family friend, checking in periodically and attending my graduation with flowers and genuine pride. The chronic anxiety I developed about medical situations eventually lessened with therapy, though I still felt my heart rate spike whenever I had abdominal pain of any kind. 3 years later, when Derek was released from prison, he sent a letter attempting to apologize and rebuild relationship, but I never opened it because some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive. You only get one chance to choose a child's life over your career ambitions, and he'd chosen wrong when it mattered most. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too, so subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.